Karen Donfried with the German Marshall Fund, and I'm so delighted to welcome you for a conversation with Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs, David Malpass, on transatlantic economic ties. We thought it was an opportune moment for this conversation. Of course, the transatlantic economic relationship continues to be critical for both sides of the Atlantic. And we thought 10 years after the financial crisis of 2008 and the ensuing recession, when economies on both sides of the Atlantic are growing again, it would be great to step back and take a look at this vital relationship. Now, all of you have Undersecretary Malpass's full bio, so I just want to underscore that in his role as Undersecretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Treasury, he is the principal advisor to the Secretary of the Treasury on international economic issues. So that is a very large portfolio that covers everything from international finance to investment to economic development and international debt policy. He will be heading to Argentina later this week for the role he plays in the G20. And what's so impressive about the Undersecretary's background is that he has deep experience both in government, and that includes prior stints at the Treasury, but also at the State Department, and he has a very impressive background in the private sector as well. And I think all of those skills are coming to bear in his current role. I want to share with you that this is being live streamed, so there are folks watching from all over the world, as well as those of you in the room. So, of course, this is on the record. And if any of you want to join on Twitter, the hashtag is GMFUS, German Marshall Fund of the United States. So feel free to tweet. And I'll just give you a sense of the run of show. So the Undersecretary is going to deliver some brief prepared remarks to lay the table for a conversation that I will begin with him and then will continue with all of you. So with that, Undersecretary Malpass, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was very nice. I'd like to thank the German Marshall Fund for inviting me today, and especially thank you for hosting and this discussion and moderating. Since its founding in the early 1970s, the German Marshall Fund has been dedicated to the worthy objective of strengthening transatlantic dialogue. In line with this objective, I'd like to discuss the transatlantic economic and financial relationship today. As we speak, President Trump is completing an important trip to NATO headquarters, the United Kingdom, and Helsinki. As is clear, the United States regards the transatlantic relationship as one of our most important in the world, but one that is facing deep challenges. One of my top priorities is building sound transatlantic relationships aimed at strengthening the U.S. economy and lowering regulatory barriers abroad for U.S. firms. I'd like to share my thoughts on some of the key issues, including observations from my recent trips to Ukraine and to Basel, Switzerland, related to the Financial Stability Board, or the FSB as it's fondly called. European nations and the United States play key roles in global economic and financial fora. While we have differences, we cooperate in several areas in the G7, G20, IMF, World Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, at the OECD, and the FSB. I'd like to give you some detailed examples of both the challenges and the areas of cooperation, and then turn to the big picture goals of financial stability, robust capital markets, lower financial regulatory barriers, and stronger global growth. We work across the Atlantic on almost a daily basis to foster better management of the international financial and regulatory organizations. This includes their size, structure, and personnel, and the quality and effectiveness of their programs. We share common interests with Europe in the need for transparency in bilateral and multilateral debt, fairness in procurement, higher standards in the fight against corruption, bribery, money laundering, and terrorism, and concern over China's non-market policies and its aggressive expansion in developing countries. Our ultimate goal for the international financial institutions is to allow people to achieve greater prosperity and a higher median income. This presents challenges in the European relationship because Europe's representatives in international organizations sometimes, perhaps often, favor an expansion of multilateralism and more government programs. This often conflicts with the goal of greater prosperity. The reality is that higher median incomes is mostly achieved through economic and political freedom and a supportive environment in terms of sound money, restraint in the size, power, and taxation of central governments, and an appropriate regulatory framework that facilitates growth in median income. We don't have nearly enough instances of multilateralism aiding in this process, but we have many instances, including several this year, in which multilateral programs have contributed to turmoil. We've worked with several European nations over the past year to agree on major reforms of the World Bank. Assuming endorsement by the bank's Board of Governors, this will result in a capital increase that focuses on the implementation of a lending limit to stop the cycle of repeated capital increases and on graduation of higher income borrowers so that a bigger percentage of the lending can go to lower income countries. In particular, World Bank loans to higher income borrowers, such as China, will be reduced sharply. We're currently joining others in the G7 to oppose the pay increase being proposed for the World Bank executive directors. As many of you know, the World Bank is run by a large staff of highly compensated administrators. In addition, the bank has 25 resident executive directors, each with well-staffed offices and large representational and travel expenses. The result is an expensive overhead which detracts materially from the mission of designing and funding effective development programs for poorer countries. To name a few more areas of cooperation, we're working with European countries to reform the governance structure of the Korea-based Green Climate Fund, to discourage the EBRD from expanding into sub-Saharan Africa, and to narrow the OECD's activities and refocus it on its mission. Now, let me spend a little more time on the FSB based in Basel, Switzerland. After years of often costly expansion of its regulatory activities, we're working across the Atlantic to refocus the FSB on its core mandate of financial stability. There's agreement that it should become more transparent to external shareholders and take full advantage of its foundation, which is consensus-based and membership-driven. We recognize many past overreaches in multilateral regulatory activities. However, our engagement in international financial regulatory fora, including the FSB, is necessary to promoting three core U.S. objectives. First, international financial stability. Second, consistency of international regulatory outcomes. And third, improvement of regulations and the regulatory structure so that they do not stifle innovation or economic growth at home and abroad. Treasury supports the FSB's recent decision to focus on evaluating the effects of the international financial regulatory reforms launched after the financial crisis, rather than setting new standards. We want the FSB to improve oversight, transparency, and stakeholder engagement, and are closely engaged in the ongoing review of the FSB's processes and procedural guidelines. Ultimately, we in Europe would benefit from maintaining a level regulatory playing field across jurisdictions. It's imperative that regulations do not create unnecessary distortions that impede economic growth or the productive flow of capital. Regulations should achieve appropriately calibrated outcomes that maintain financial stability, but they do not need to be identical across jurisdictions, as some in Europe would contend. This imperative was discussed in detail at last month's meeting of the U.S.-EU Joint Financial Regulatory Forum. This brings me to the issue of Brexit, Britain's exit from the European Union. Our interest post-Brexit is that the UK and EU become strong, fair economic partners for us. including faster growth, robust capital markets, and open, balanced trading relationships. We are concerned that the Brexit process is giving European regulators an opportunity to move in harmful directions, including on financial regulation. In particular, the addition of non-prudential equivalence regulations and potential requirements to relocate markets or activities to the continent risk increased costs and market fragmentation. This would weaken Europe's already slow growth rates and further polarize Europe's economic performance to the detriment of Europe's weaker economies. From the U.S. standpoint, a Brexit outcome that imposes regulatory requirements based on non-prudential considerations would harm U.S.-based financial firms and also hurt Europe, which we hope will become a better trading partner. We have urged officials in the UK and the EU to reach an agreement that does not disrupt financial markets or cause reduced liquidity, dislocation, or market fragmentation. As with the international financial institutions, we will continue our active engagement on financial regulatory policy issues, but recognize sizable challenges in the relationship. Brexit rightfully is on everyone's mind because it will fundamentally change the economies and laws of Europe and the transatlantic relationships. But it is not the only potential challenge. Before Brexit, Europe already faced slow growth, weak investment, and dramatic demographic decline. The IMF released its World Economic Outlook this morning. I think it did. It was scheduled for 10 a.m. this morning, showing weaker prospects in many European countries, even as the U.S. continues solid growth. Tax and regulatory reform have worked in the U.S., but are not widely embraced in Europe, leaving a sharp divergence in economic performance. This is especially true of small businesses, for which the U.S. climate has turned up, but the European climate remains unfavorable. It has been over 8 years since the onset of the euro crisis, which threatened the exit of Greece from the euro. Since the crisis, Europe has slowly built government mechanisms to respond to future crises, but the core problem of slow growth is still severe. Italy's real GDP is smaller than it was in 2004, and Greece is smaller than 2000, showing the extent of the growth problem. The market movements that we saw at the end of May in response to Italian political developments underscore that macro vulnerabilities remain in the Eurozone. Europe could boost overall growth through policy reforms, but with the exception of France's important labor reforms, there seem to be only isolated prospects for labor mobility, smaller, less intrusive government, or lower tax rates. Not enough Europeans think of starting a small business, or if they do, they often plan to launch outside the European Union. Even as Europe continues to struggle to strengthen the euro area's finances, leaders have voiced the clear merit in strengthening their cooperation in security and defense. President Trump reiterated at last week's NATO summit that all NATO members need to reach their stated commitment of spending 2% of GDP on defense by 2024, and then strive to do even more. Ultimately, a physically secure Europe would be more financially secure as well. Within the vein of increasing prosperity, let me touch on a topic related to European economic and energy security, the proposed Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. The United States shares the concerns of many European partners that this project would undermine Europe's own energy diversification efforts, deepen Russian dominance in gas markets, and increase Russia's economic leverage over the continent. Nord Stream 2, if built, could concentrate over 75% of Europe's gas imports through a single corridor transiting the Baltic Sea. It would be unwise for Europe to make itself even more vulnerable to Russian gas imports and provide Russia another tool to pressure or coerce European countries, including Ukraine. During my late June visit to Kyiv, several Ukrainian officials noted their concerns with the project and its potential to undermine Ukraine's independence. Nord Stream 2 could cost Ukraine up to $2 billion annually in transit revenues, severely undermining our efforts to help secure an independent and economically sustainable Ukraine. Ukraine continues its long journey to reforming its economy and achieving faster growth. Progress has been made on improving the governance and profitability of Naftogaz, that's the state-owned gas company, and improving oversight and resilience of the financial sector. Just last week, the Rada strengthened the anti-corruption process, but Ukraine's work and the work of the U.S. and EU in supporting reform efforts is not complete. To grow, further progress is needed, including land reform, demonopolization, natural gas price reforms, and further measures to counter corruption in the lending system. In conclusion, the Trump administration seeks to engage globally in ways that strengthen our economy and security, which are a key part of a stronger global economy. Our relationship with Europe figures prominently in this approach, and the challenges and opportunities in the transatlantic relationship will be an important factor in our participation at this week's G20 ministerial in Buenos Aires. Thank you for your interest today, and I look forward to a productive discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Undersecretary Malpass. That was a really terrific overview of the many issues that connect us across the Atlantic. And I want to pick up on several of the points that you raised, but I will definitely start with the news of the day, which is that President Trump is meeting with President Putin in Helsinki as we sit here. And certainly, U.S. and European allies have worked very closely together with regard to Russia, whether it's politically or economically over time. And clearly, we face some major challenges in that relationship, whether it's the Skripal poisoning in Britain or concerns about Russian interference in U.S. presidential elections in 2016. But one area where the U.S. and the European Union have worked closely together has been putting in place sanctions on Russia for Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and then the ongoing Russian aggression in Ukraine's east. And it's terrific that you just had that visit to Ukraine. We see the United States and the European Union continuing to coordinate on sanctions. With that as the backdrop, are you hopeful nonetheless that we in the U.S., that President Trump can encourage Russia to better respect the rule of law? Because surely for U.S. companies active in Russia, that is important to their interests. And I'm wondering if you look at the meeting of President Trump with President Putin today in Helsinki, from where you sit, what would be sort of a most helpful outcome of that meeting?
So I'm glad that there's a discussion going on, and I really am not going to foreshadow or try to anticipate the constructive outcome from it, other than just to say that that there is a need for dialogue, and then, as you say, a need for respect of rule of law. So let me leave it there and see what other things as you know from my remarks here, the thrust of it is on growth in Europe and ways that we can move in that direction.
Well, and I think Europeans would agree with you that dialogue is good. We'll just see what comes out of it. To maybe dig a little deeper on the sanctions point, certainly sanctions are a powerful way that we protect our national security interests. And the Treasury plays an important role on sanctions. We've not applied sanctions only with regard to Russia and Russia's behavior in Ukraine. We've applied them in the case of North Korea. We've applied them in the case of Iran. Maybe let me just spend a minute on Iran, because President Trump's decision to pull the U.S. out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the deal trying to slow Iran's progress to developing a nuclear weapon, was something that was upsetting to our European allies. And I just noticed in today's Financial Times, U.S. dashes Europe hopes of relief from Iran sanctions. And the challenge for Europe on this, of course, is the role that the dollar plays in the international financial system, the role that U.S. banks play in the global banking system. And what I wanted to draw you out on is I was remembering a former Treasury Secretary, Jack Lew, giving a speech back in 2016, warning that we in the U.S. might overuse sanctions. And I'm just going to quote a line from that speech where he said, "The risk that sanctions overreach will ultimately drive business activity from the U.S. financial system could become more acute if alternatives to the U.S. as a center of financial activity and to the U.S. dollar as the world's preeminent reserve currency assume a larger role in the global financial system." And I'd be interested in your sense of what the balance here is. I mean, sanctions is a very powerful weapon for a U.S. administration versus a potential overuse of that.
Sanctions are powerful, and the judicious use of them is important and very, very useful, and I think can move the world toward peace. And so you've named North Korea, Russia, and Iran. I want to also mention Venezuela, where the U.S. is using sanctions to support democracy there and to try to move the Western that starkly non-democratic regime toward a more free and open society. And so, as we think about it, clearly, if you were excessively using sanctions, that would lessen the impact of the sanctions. But in the case that you've focused on Iran, Secretary Mnuchin has been very strong on this issue. Sanctions are handled by my colleague Sigal Mandeliker, Undersecretary at Treasury for Terrorism Finance, and they have made the very strong case of the imperative for the world in dealing not only with the nuclear weapons in development in Iran, but also missiles and terrorism financing. So we have a broad spectrum problem that the world needs to be dealing with, and the U.S. is leading in this effort. And so I really think that we need to put in the context, you've raised 2016, but we have the deeply problematic situation of a set of U.S. rules that were to have gone through the Senate process and did not go through the Senate process, were not supported. This is the exit of Iran from the sanctions was not supported by the process in the U.S. And so we, as a world, need to be finding a direction that deals with this major threat in Iran.
So your sense is that there isn't a medium-term or longer-term concern about the role of the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency, that there could be steps others could take to try to diminish the quite large role that the U.S. currently plays in the international financial system?
The U.S. dollar remains the most deeply traded and system of currency in the world, and I back that up with the strength of the U.S. economy. We forget sometimes, but the U.S. Economy is the world's biggest by far, and has been strengthening since the incoming Trump administration, with policies that have added substantially to growth and pushed, as we know, the unemployment rate for women, for minorities, for the unemployment claims to historic lows. These are hugely powerful, and so I think we shouldn't be looking for as much for the weaknesses, but for the challenge that is being brought by North Korea, by Iran in terms of their weapons programs. These are supremely dangerous to the world, and the U.S. is showing leadership, and President Trump is showing leadership in how to deal with those.
You, in your remarks, also made a reference to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and Ukraine is concerned about that. We have several of our European allies, particularly in Central Eastern Europe, that have spoken quite strongly against Nord Stream 2 as well. And of course, this is a pipeline that would connect Russia to Germany and could let Germany import really double the amount of Russian gas that's currently going to Western Europe. And it seems to me that essentially all of the permissions needed for the pipeline are already in place. And when I was in Brussels last week, GMF, together with some other organizations, organized a side event on the margins of the NATO summit. One of the comments of President Trump that got a good deal of attention was in a breakfast meeting he had with the NATO Secretary General. He was very critical of Germany's role in this energy project, and in fact referred to Germany as a captive of Russia because of it. And there was some chatter on the margins about whether the U.S. administration might make a decision to apply sanctions on European energy companies if they participated in the Nord Stream 2 project. And I'd be interested in your views if you think we might, in fact, see sanctions put in place on European energy companies in that context.
I'm not going to anticipate future action at all. So simply to say, dependence on a source of energy that's Russia is not only raises the political issues of how do you deal if one of your if a lot of your energy supply comes from one supplier, but also from an economic and financial standpoint, diversification is a standard technique in Europe. Many countries in Europe recognize that and would rather be going in another direction.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Excuse me, let me make clear, going in another direction than dependence on Nord Stream 2.
Yeah. Just to stay on maybe some of the more sensitive issues in our relationship with our European allies, obviously the trade agenda has been getting a lot of press. And there were comments the president made over the weekend about how concerned he is about our trade relationship with the EU. You could argue that he was asked a leading question about who the foes of the U.S. are. And in that context, he expressed his concern about the role the EU is playing on trade. Of course, the administration has put in place tariffs on imports of European steel and aluminum. The European Union has called those tariffs illegal, a classic case of protectionism, and the EU has said they will bring a case to the World Trade Organization. The EU has also put in place retaliatory tariffs. Are we in a trade war with Europe?
As I laid out in my remarks, what I would like to see is Europe growing more than it is. So one of the challenges, as you think about the trade disputes that people are talking about and dealing with now, it gets lost in the shuffle, the negative effect on the people of countries to have such an imbalance in the global trading relationship. Let's take an example. If we think about China, it heavily subsidized the expansion of its steel industry over the last period of time, to the point where its output of global steel expanded many-fold as a percentage of the world steel supply. That disadvantages workers around the world, severely disadvantages workers around the world. And so that creates a trade challenge that needs to be addressed. Now, there have been dialogues on excess steel capacity, sometimes hosted either on the fringes or by the OECD, that have simply not been successful in trying to get the allocation of capital back on track. So you've got a world situation where China is growing and is one of the large creators of new capital, but is deploying that capital in non-market ways. And so that means the government decides that this industry is the industry that needs to grow, and it picks the winners within China's society. And so that's creating global strains around the world.
I think that our close allies, whether that's the Europeans or the Canadians, would absolutely agree with your point and concern about an overproduction of steel in China. And so their perception is that they're caught up in this targeting of China because of where they fall on steel production. Is that a fair perception on their part?
As I said in my remarks, we have challenges, we have some opportunities. So we talk closely with Europe within the G7 and the G20 about ways that the world should respond or to this situation where China had been working toward liberalization and committed to market liberalization as part of the WTO process, but then basically moved away from that direction. And so now we have, as I mentioned, one of the world's big and growing economies allocating capital in a way that is not market-based, which ends up slowing all of the world's growth and opportunities. And so that's something that we have cooperate that with a lot of European discussions. There's a common recognition that this is a problem. This is something that's negatively affecting all of us. What are the various aspects of that problem? So let me make sure we're talking about some of the similar things. China uses subsidies, which means that industries are created in non-market ways through those subsidies. China has moved more toward reliance on its state-owned enterprises. This is something that most of the rest of the world is trying to move in another direction, away from state-run, state-owned, state-guided, and state-controlled enterprises, yet China has been moving more in that direction. China also is in its international relations using subsidized credit, often in very large quantities, to governments that are not in a position to make a decision on whether that's good for the people. They may not be a very democratic country, or they may not be a very organized government that can actually find out the terms. I meet with finance ministers often, and if you ask what are the terms of your new loan from China, they don't know what the terms are, because China in often cases is giving a take it or leave it proposition to countries and ending up with projects that aren't very beneficial for the people of the country. They might be beneficial for the government leaders that are signing on to the projects, but not beneficial to the people of the countries. And then you're left with a lot of debt for subsequent governments in those countries. So these are some of the major problems. And as we think about our relations with Europe, this is something where we are often seeing the situation in a similar vein. One other that I didn't mention but should have is the challenge from China's heavy investment into technology, critical industries, and so these are areas where the U.S. is taking measures and steps to create a better environment, and we work with Europe in that regard as well, because they also recognize this challenge as something that can undermine their countries, their freedoms, their markets, their economies.
I think that was a really helpful overview of how the administration views China and the challenge China poses. And of course, it also explains why the administration has put in place tariffs on China. And I was reading an article about the retaliatory tariffs that China is putting in place. And one of those is that China has slapped a 40% tariff on U.S. car imports. And what was striking to me is one of the things we celebrate that's very good for the U.S. economy is the large amount of European investment that's here in the U.S., including German car companies. And the press article I saw was pointing out that China imposing those counter tariffs on U.S. car imports is leading BMW to move some of its production of its SUVs out of the U.S. So it was sort of having this knock-on effect. And BMW also raised prices for the SUVs it produces here because it can't absorb that 40% tariff. But I was wondering if you could speak to the knock-on effect. Ooh, I'm getting all choked up. Of that tariff war.
Yeah, I think we should be choked up also about the challenge facing U.S. workers in an environment that went too far on the idea or the belief or the hope that China was moving toward a market system that would work better in the future, and so year after year, that isn't what was happening, and so we end up with big areas of U.S. labor markets that have been disadvantaged by the result. And so, the specifics. I suppose we're going to be seeing targeted stories of problems, but then we ought to recognize that there have been massive problems for a big swath of U.S. workers. One thing I'm happy about is the participation rate looks like it has finally bottomed and is beginning to go up. That was one of the very weak parts of the U.S. economy prior to the Trump administration. The participation rate that stayed stubbornly very low. That means people who could be in the labor force but either are choosing not to or aren't finding their way into the labor force, which means that there were literally millions of people that were being left out of the system, in part because of the trade environment. So as we look forward, we should keep an eye out for the opportunity or the benefit that would come from a better global trading system in which a lot more workers in the U.S. would find their way into the labor force and want to be part of the labor force and be available for productive work. I think that's beginning. A lot of that has to come from small businesses that are benefiting from the tax cut, that are benefiting from the regulatory environment starting up. We need to see a lot more new small businesses created in the U.S. that would then hire young workers or workers that haven't been in the labor force before. I think that process is going on, and a lot of the press is on the negative side of what could go wrong or problems when in a lot of ways, we're at record low unemployment and low for some critical classes of workers that we all ought to say, wow, that's an important step forward.
I think that's a really good point. Let's not miss the bigger picture for some of these specific cases like BMW's SUV production in the U.S. And I think that probably most folks active looking at geoeconomics would say that the big strategic challenge to the United States in the 21st century is a rising China and how you manage that. And GMF does a good bit of work looking at how can the U.S. and the European Union cooperate on China. And I think we agree across the Atlantic on a lot of the challenges, whether it's, as you mentioned, state-owned enterprises, whether it's forced technology transfer. And so we at GMF have tried to think about how can the U.S. and Europe cooperate more effectively in trying to meet those challenges. And I'm curious, with the backdrop of the trade tensions, do you see constructive ways for the U.S. and the EU to pick specific issues where we share a similar view that China poses a challenge to us, where we could work cooperatively?
There are many of those, and that dialogue actually happens more than people realize at the G20 and G7 meetings. Secretary Mnuchin is a super strong interlocutor with the European ministers at every level. So if you think about the relationships that he's established, but also the subject matter discussions. I'm in many of the meetings, and should give heart, give encouragement to people to know that how strong the leadership is on that cooperation front. So there's candid, constructive dialogue on both the challenges, and you've mentioned some of them, but also on the opportunities. How do we make this better? Where are we going next year? What's your perception of what China is doing, and how can we how can we respond to that in a way that will make the world better? Those are the thrust of the conversations. We'll have several of those over the next week as we go into this G20 process in Buenos Aires.
I take your point about that cooperation in the G7 and the G20, which I think is really powerful. I was also struck in your remarks when you talked about our role in the international financial institutions. And you gave this specific example of the agreement around a capital increase in the IMF.
In the World Bank.
In the World Bank, thank you. And how that was allowing us to focus our lending on lower income countries and reduce lending to China. Would that be another example of this? And are there others in that World Bank context that you might want to highlight?
Yes, that is one example. And in addition, and I mentioned in the report, Europe has a recognition that the multilateral institutions often have raised their pay and their number of employees, and so there is within Europe a recognition of the need for some development of fiscal prudence. We've seen the very hard efforts in Greece by the Greek government sometimes, by the European Commission, by the ECB, on finding ways that there can be fiscal prudence. That means not wasting taxpayer money on things. And so we often find with Europe that sentiment with regard to the international financial institutions. But I mentioned in my remarks, one area where there's a difference, or where there can be differences, is as you're looking at specific countries, one of the challenges that we face going forward is not enough of them are growing. This is in Africa, even in Latin America. There need to be, for the world to be making progress, there need to be many more countries that are finding a way forward economically. And on that, I think Europe often is looking at a model which is more government-oriented than it can be. If you think about how a country gains traction, it allows businesses to hire workers, to choose the workers that they hire and to pay them and to increase their pay based on productivity. That requires a degree of labor mobility, and often we're trying to interface with a European system that's not exactly on that basis as far as where growth comes from. We know from the U.S. side, growth comes from sound money, comes from low tax rates on a broad base. I don't want to lecture, except it's important as we think about where Europe is going to find some common ground, that we need to have regulations that are not overly expensive and that are actually beneficial in what you're trying to achieve. Europe's fallen, and I mentioned this in my remarks, fallen into a cycle where lots of parts of Europe make money if there's more regulations. And that, if you apply that then through the international financial institutions into poorer countries, that becomes a strong burden on growth, or an impediment to growth. So those are areas that we can work in, and that means concrete examples or individual countries where there needs to be a more common framework for growth.
That was very helpful, because what you were doing just there was elucidating the point you made in your prepared remarks. You had this comment about Europeans favor an expansion of multilateralism, and that can conflict with economic growth. And what you just did was elucidate.
Yeah, and you know, that phrase may sound odd in the U.S., where people recognize that international organizations can't keep getting bigger all the time, because that takes capital, that takes talented people away from the private sector, which is the part that's going to pay taxes, that's going to that's going to lead innovation. So you can't keep going down that path. But in Europe, you hear, or I hear in meetings, people saying, "Well, we believe in multilateralism." Now, I think what Europe often means is they want more coherence within the Eurozone or within the European Union, and they've translated that onto a global frame where it may not really be as applicable. But oftentimes it's phrased as, we support multilateralism. That's Europeans. That's Europeans, and that, you know, is discordant in the U.S. Because it's so expensive, and it hasn't really worked very well in terms of supporting growth in the countries that really need it. So how do we put that together? How do we talk with them on actual country programs, on the organizations that can help countries move in the right direction? So we spend a lot of time on that.
Well, and I'm sure you believe in multilateralism. It's based on your role in the G7, the G20, the IFEs.
Okay, let me be careful. I think multilateralism has gone too far. That there were points in history after World War II, for example, where the Marshall Plan was such an important part of world growth, and then as the world confronted the Soviet Union itself, and you know, we forget about it. It's so long ago, but it captured, or it was creating major problems in the world, where some coordinated effort was perhaps helpful in pushing back on that threat, on the nuclear threat, on the geopolitical threat. But as we come now, the organizations, we're in a world where private capital, where there's simply more capital, more savings, more available capital for growth that can be channeled best through a market system. Most of us agree on that as at least a starting point for thinking about growth. And if you go down that line, then you don't need more multilateralism. So I support institutions that are effective at helping people around the world grow and raise their median income. The middle of the society needs to find advance, not just the upper edges of the society. And I was pushing back a little on the idea of, I don't blindly support multilateralism. I think we need major changes to make it work in a way that supports growth and security, and especially that works for American workers.
Okay, so it's you want to unpack that term of what does multilateralism mean? Is it effective in serving the goal of economic growth? And you know, to stay with that idea, I mean, certainly one of the challenges both the U.S. and the European Union face in having effective multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF is how do you manage the rising weight of China in those institutions? And do you think that there's more, or are there reforms that the U.S. and the EU are working on together to try to manage the increasing role of China?
Yes. One of those areas is personnel, where China has forcefully pushed for people in senior positions that are not really as qualified as others would be in those positions. So we need to find a way, a balance within the organizations between finding merit and qualified people versus China's goal of inserting itself. It's not just in the multilaterals. Clearly, and I mentioned before and in my remarks, China has been expanding aggressively in developing countries through its organizations, through its through techniques that would not be acceptable in the U.S. in terms of the lack of transparency of loans, for example. And so this is a broad challenge of how can China work in multilateral organizations that are promoting market-oriented reforms when China itself is really not moving in that direction? And how do we, the rest of the world, interact with China on that challenge? So it would be useful for the world to have people from China who are interested in market-oriented reforms working in the international financial institutions, but sometimes that's not really the candidates that are put forward.
I have far too many questions, but I'm going to stop. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to open it up to you, but I have whole areas I didn't even touch: Eurozone governance, financial regulatory cooperation, anti-money laundering. But before we open it up, the last question I wanted to ask you is a preview of your upcoming trip to Argentina. You're going there for G20 work. And if there's, and you mentioned it in your prepared remarks, but I'd love to get a sense from you about how the U.S. and the European Union cooperate in that G20 setting.
Sure. Well, the G20 includes some European countries, some Latin countries, some Asia countries, and it's a mix. Secretary Mnuchin has been very effective in building those relationships. So as we go in and he goes into the bigger meetings, there's a deep respect for the U.S. and an interest in that. And so one of the things I imagine that will be taking place this week is a discussion of the outcome of the president's trip and the directions that the world can head. Given, I mean, it's a complex trip that the president is still engaged in. He's in Helsinki right now, and so that will be, so working with European colleagues on how to put all of that together into the next stage. And you know, I'll say it sounds too simple, but there is, against that background, the U.S. is constantly pushing the idea that growth can be faster here in the U.S. than it was. Clearly, we went through a bad, long period of years where average growth was simply too slow. It's picking up now. We're looking at 3% growth now. That helps all of the world. And then one of the things that would help us is if other countries could begin to strengthen their own economies. So, you know, almost every meeting, it has that as a backdrop. What it is that we're doing and that they either are or could be doing or aren't doing in terms of faster growth and a more sturdy global financial system. So that makes the meetings are a positive experience from that standpoint. And Secretary Mnuchin is, a very strong leader in that context.
I'm going to open it to you, but I am going to do a quick follow-up on that because, a very clear message throughout I felt was your concern about growth in Europe. You gave France credit for trying to put in place some reforms. You mentioned Brexit briefly, but clearly the second largest economy leaving the European Union not only has implications for financial regulation, as you mentioned, but there's a broader hit that Europe will be taking. Do you have advice for our European allies? What do you think are the three most consequential things that European countries could be doing to try to spur growth?
Thank you. I love, this. That's a question that I spend a lot of time on. So, advice is, in a way, is a discussion that people have and so it's almost putting ideas on the table. So rather than thinking of it as advice, on the table has to be for Europe, Italy, and the challenge of labor mobility. A critical part of the way the U.S. grows is that people can move from job to job. And it's much less so in Europe. And so finding a way that some of those rules can be liberalized. France is struggling with that, and through the spring there were proposals by the government. There was pushback by the unions of saying, no, we don't want more movement, or we don't want more hours. Critical in the U.S. is a system that allows and invites overtime when the company needs more hours, or the worker wants to provide more hours. We have a system that flexes around that. Europe less so. So I'll put that one on. I want to mention the very high. I don't know that everyone agrees with me on this, but a value-added tax rate that is so high. Oftentimes, Europe's are 20% and higher. So in Greece, many products are facing a 24% value-added tax. That means you provide the good or the service, and the government's going to get a quarter of, that kind of a rate impedes the free flow of goods and services around Europe. And you see it in, for example, in Germany, a lower consumption rate, a lower import rate, a very large trade surplus that can have, or that would be improved through simply faster growth. And then I should, as a third, you asked for three, so I'll give a third, which is the financial regulatory reform. And so I went into that some in my remarks, but it's critical to Europe's growth that it find a way to avoid the fragmentation that's tempting. You can't have a system where each asset manager has to have personnel in each country. It's too expensive. It impedes the development of capital markets. And so, these are kind of detailed problems, and yet they have, if you think about how is it that the U.S. is growing so much faster than Europe, one aspect of that is a more robust more robust financial services industry, and Europe can, I think, find its way forward in a way that will allow the financial services to help them with their growth. That means organizations that can lend to small businesses, organizations that can create private equity interests that really innovate and transform companies, and so on. Europe's needs to go further, faster in that area.
Super. Thanks so much. Okay, now really over to you. Who wants to jump in? Please.
Hi, I'm Peter Sparting, also with the German Marshall Fund. I wanted to follow up on the IMF part. You talked a bit about reform and especially about the World Bank. If I can draw you out a bit about the role of the IMF, especially from a European perspective. Of course, the IMF was involved in Europe quite heavily over the last 10 years. Is that something the US point of view is now more critical of? Should it refocus its effort? Is it more a monitoring organization, or what's your take on the role of the IMF going forward?
Well, there are a number of issues. One ongoing is they're in the 15th review of the quota structure, and so it's something that will kind of be widely talked about over the next year. Our view is that they have adequate resources for the role that they play in international crises. We've seen a recent example in Argentina where the IMF was able to get involved very quickly and appear, it seems to be helping stabilize that situation. And so as your question was somewhat on Europe itself, and Europe has said that it won't be seeking IMF capital, and so the tension that the U.S. was very resistant, reluctant, and skeptical of IMF involvement in Greece. That I think it's useful now that Greece is concluding its third review of its IMF program and will be standing more on its own in international financial markets. That's a good step. And so you're raising an area where the U.S. and Europe aren't as far apart as they were before, because Europe's decided not to be looking to the IMF for resources in the event of future crises, and that's consistent with a U.S. position that that's not a necessary and maybe not even the best direction for Europe to look in the event of a financial crisis. Also, and as I mentioned in my remarks, Europe has taken steps itself, the European governments, to create some new structures that didn't exist at the time of the Greek crisis. So the ESM, the European Support Mechanism structure, Stability mechanism, excuse me. The ESM was created, was funded, and it has been utilized and shown some value. And so those are all kind of in the context of IMF role. One other thing that I'll say is in our interaction, we've encouraged the IMF to be focused within its conditionality. So in a lot of countries, the temptation, if you have a lot of economists, is each one finds something that ought to be changed in a country. But as you break it down, in many cases, there's one or two things that are critical to change, and if you don't change those, it's hard to get to the next step of growth. And so, we might single out in the U.S. Our tax system was, we had an extraterritorial tax system that had one of the world's highest corporate rates. And so in order to get growth started, you had to address that. And then other things begin to fall into place. So as we think about the IMF's role, kind of identifying the one or two critical changes or improvements that are needed and that the government of the country supports, that then can put you on a path toward growth.
And it's wonderful to have Ambassador Wouters of Belgium here, and you're next.
Thank you very much. Two trade-related questions, one specific and also for the Treasury. Because of tariffs, consumers will pay more on certain products, but government revenue may increase because of the tariffs. So my question was, and without wanting to take too many steps ahead, has Treasury already given some reflection on the use of these increased government revenues, given the fact that potentially we might be talking about a rather big or significant sum. I mean, history has taught us that economic history, you can use it for tax purposes, you can use it for debt relief, you can use it for other purposes. So that would be my first question. My second question is a bit broader, if I may, is whether you could, from your perspective, enlighten us about the strategic goal of the overall trade policy of the current administration. Is it not to run trade deficits with individual countries? Is it to restore production here in the United States, specific sectors like steel, cars, and maybe other sectors? Is it to pressure, and on that point you were very eloquent, to China to roll back on practices that are bad for the more advanced U.S. industries and foreign direct investment by U.S. companies in China? So which is the strategic objective? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and congratulations to Belgium on number 3, right? And if there's anyone from France here, congratulations first to you. I'm surprised you're here and not still celebrating. So as far as use of government revenues, there will be a budget process. I think there also have to be estimates of how much that might raise. That I don't think that should be a focus of the policy, and it wasn't in the formulation of the policy. So we've got to let that kind of evolve politically, and also see we're still at the point where many of the tariffs are either not yet implemented or are just being implemented. So I've got to kind of put off thinking about that point. As far as the strategic goals, those are so growth is the overriding strategic goal, and that means growth. And I've emphasized in my remarks the median income. So if you think about the oddity of the U.S. years from 2010 onward, it was that decline in median income, and that was so concerning. That means the middle people within the economy were simply losing income from the circumstances, from the overall makeup of the economy. It was at a time when the U.S. was growing and the upper end was doing well, but the goal is to find a fair, balanced economic environment, and a recognition that trade has not been working for that end point. And so that's the goal. And then I wanted to mention, if we think about where the world has gotten, there are some countries running persistent, very large imbalances. And so that we are trying to address within, and the IMF has a whole study aspect on that. And we could single out China, Germany on that score and say, okay, what is it that's happening, and how can that evolve? And I wanted to mention the WTO itself, or if we call it the World Trading System. That's the World Trade Organization, which has not worked well, or certainly not as well as it was intended to work when the U.S. joined when China was brought into the WTO, I guess in the year 2000. So there are, I think, major issues facing the world trading system from a organizational standpoint that need to be addressed as well. So I've laid out some context for this, and we mentioned earlier the challenge of investment or targeted investment especially by China, but by other countries as well, in critical technologies that needs to be thoughtfully addressed as well, which we're doing.
And in the back, Ambassador Alex Hall.
Thank you very much. Alex Hall from the Atlantic Council. In your remarks earlier, you talked about your concerns about the impact of Brexit on the economy and financial markets. And you said that you had been engaging with EU and UK partners to make some recommendations on that. I wondered if you could go into a little bit more detail on what your recommendations are and what the reaction has been from European and British partners. Thank you.
I don't think I used the word recommendation, and I only raised that because we've tried to be a good partner, transatlantic partner with the UK and the EU, and recognize that they have to work with each other. And this is not one of the world issues where the U.S. is the focus. They're the focus, and so we're respectful of that when we work with them. So more what we want to do in these dialogues is understand what they're doing and then think about the impact that would have on the U.S. and then share that with them. So if you go in this direction, it would have this impact on us. We just want you to be aware of that. That's more the point where that dialogue is. So we meet separately and then sometimes together with the UK, with the EU. It's a topic, for example, at a G7 meeting that at my level, so called the deputies meeting, say 6 months ago or so, there was a briefing by each of their people involved in their negotiations, so that not only we, but the rest of the G7 meeting that would include Canada, Japan, would understand what the way the EU and the UK are thinking about it. Better understanding is important. So I'm kind of ducking the substance of this. You can read a lot in the newspaper, and even in this morning's newspaper, the issues are known to the negotiators in Europe and the UK. There's the customs issues, there's the border issues, there's the financial regulatory issues. I mentioned in my remarks today the equivalence, the regulatory equivalence. So the U.S. has had a relationship with the European Union, which included the UK, on regulatory matters. And now as they break up, we need to form strong relationships with each one. So I'm giving you color on that rather than specifics.
Maybe just a quick follow-up on that. There are various pieces that are changing of the global financial regulatory picture. I mean, one surely is Brexit. Another is our recent reforms to Dodd-Frank. What do you think the implications of our reforms are on European financial regulation?
They've been substantial in that the U.S. has the world's largest financial markets, and we interact with Europe substantially. Though many of the issues raised in Dodd-Frank were then began to be discussed and absorbed in Europe through both the Financial Stability Board and also the Basel Committee, which is the committee of central banks that is so important in the capital of financial institutions. So we're still, the U.S., as we just did the banking reform bill, sometimes called the CRAPO bill, or the banking reform bill that went through a few months ago, that changed certain aspects of the regulatory, of the U.S. regulatory side. So we spend time explaining that to Europe, discussing it with Europe, and thinking how it will affect them. So we, the U.S., have laid down certain principles in this for example, that you should not be bound by a one-size-fits-all. You know, Europe had fewer smaller banks than the U.S., so there was a difference between the two regimes. So one of the things that we want to persuade Europe of and embed in the system is that you need to have different regulatory structure for really big institutions than might be necessary or useful for regional institutions or smaller ones. And this is critical for Europe as it tries to find ways to have faster growth. I think, has to find a way to recognize that. I mentioned also in my remarks the idea of equivalence of outcomes being important rather than the exact wording of rules. So Europe has been used to a structure where they had the same written rules in the continent as they did in the UK. And that gave an outcome that was satisfactory so that we could trust their regulators, they could trust our regulators. But as Brexit occurs, then there will be divergence in the wording of different rules, and Europe needs to find a way that that's available to them in this is a complicated area of finance, but it's mutual recognition of the regulatory environments in various areas. Otherwise, the costs go up astronomically. And so the overall goal of this should be clear to people. And you know, sometimes it's mischaracterized as softening the regulatory framework. That's not it at all. It's finding a regulatory framework that protects the financial stability of the system, that protects fully the taxpayers of the system, but that then allows for the differences between the ways financial institutions work. So our insurance industry, for example, is very different than the insurance industry in Europe. So you can't ask to have exactly the same worded rules between the two. So how do you find a way to achieve your goal, which is safety and soundness and transparency and so on? How do you find a way to do that, given that the systems really often are quite different? So that's what we're doing in these forums. It takes actually a lot of discussion in order to get the meat of it. How does your system work on this? And then in what way can we have comfort in your regulatory structure and you in ours?
Super. Well, thanks. Oh, last question,
okay.
And then we'll close it off, please.
Everybody's been very patient. Thank you.
Doug Hengel, a fellow here at the German Marshall Fund. Eurozone. There's a new Italian government which, if they follow through on their economic policies, could blow out their debt and potentially cause some problems there. Are you concerned about the health of the Eurozone? And if there were a lot of turmoil there, what would the impact be on the United States?
With growth slow, then Europe has quite a bit of debt, and especially Italy has a lot of debt, and those are challenges for its new political, evolving political system. And so, politicians often frame it as, I can spend money on you and I can spend money on you, but then as decisions are actually made, they may be able to find a way to make it work with what I called in my remarks restraint. There has to be in some spot restraint on how much the government can spend, because money's not unlimited, and that's quite apparent in Italy. So I don't have an answer. They've put together a coalition kind of government that so far is all parts are sticking to their goals, their spending goals, which were, and so I think at some point Italy will need to find some fiscal restraints, some rules that work within its political system. So I'm not so much we're in a decent spot for the world to confront some. I'll make this a parting kind of comment that I laid out in my remarks a lot of the challenges, and it's possible to get trapped into focusing on the negative side of those challenges. But we're in a decent spot for the world if you look at the way financial markets are operating, the growth rate. I think, I haven't seen it, but the IMF just put out the World Economic Outlook today that again looks for 4% growth for world growth, which is much better than what had been happening in some recent years. And so that gives you the foundation for making tough choices, for dealing. And so the thrust of my remarks was in the transatlantic relationship, we want to work with Europe to focus on things that can make their growth faster, that works for our growth and our workers. And I think we're kind of partially successful in that.
Well, thank you for ending on a semi-optimistic note. But Undersecretary Malpass, that was a very impressive tour de force of the many issues that you focus on every day. And I want to end on a bit of a lighter note, which is bringing together your compliments to Belgium for its third place finish. Because if we think about the French, Croatian, and Belgian teams, no doubt the key to their success were two of the ideas you put on the table for our European allies to pursue in terms of economic growth, and that was mobility and flexibility. So to mobility and flexibility, please join me in thanking the Undersecretary.
That's great.